They say that a house remembers everything, that the walls absorb the laughter, the tears, and the whispers of the people who live within them. But I have learned that a house is just brick and mortar until you breathe life into it, and sometimes, to save your life, you have to walk away from the very stones you helped lay. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 68 years old, and for a long time, I believed that my dignity was tied to the title of mother, wife, and keeper of the home. I was wrong. It took a cold plate of food and a silence sharper than a knife to teach me that peace is not a place you live in, but a fortress you build inside yourself. This is the story of how I lost everything I thought mattered to find the one thing I didn't know I needed. It began on a Sunday in late November, the kind of afternoon where the autumn chill in Savannah settles into your bones and demands warmth. My daughter-in-law, Isabella, had decided to host a dinner party. It was not just any dinner. It was a coronation of sorts, a gathering of her side of the family to celebrate her promotion at the law firm. We lived in the Victorian house my husband, Arthur, and I had bought 40 years ago, a house that now technically belonged to my son, Daniel, but echoed with the ghosts of my past. Isabella had been married to Daniel for 3 years. In those 3 years, I had perfected the art of becoming invisible. I had mastered the skill of shrinking, of occupying less space, of silencing my opinions until they dissolved in my throat like sugar in hot tea. I thought this was love. I thought this was what a good mother-in-law did to ensure her son's happiness. I was naive. That afternoon, the kitchen was a battlefield of aromas. I was standing at the counter, chopping fresh basil for the garnish, the rhythmic thud of the knife against the wooden board providing a fleeting sense of normalcy. Isabella swept into the room. She was beautiful, undeniably so, with hair like spun obsidian and eyes that could assess your net worth in a single glance. She wore a dress the color of bruised plums, tailored to perfection, and heels that clicked against the linoleum with the authority of a judge's gavel. "Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that did not reach her eyes. "You're making a mess." I looked down at the few stray leaves of basil on the counter. "I'm just preparing the garnish, Isabella. It will be cleaned up in a moment." She sighed, a sound of exaggerated exhaustion. "I want tonight to be flawless. My parents are driving down from Charleston. My brothers are bringing their wives. This dinner defines who we are, Eleanor. It's about image. It's about class. So, please, just stop. I'll have the caterers handle the rest. You're just getting in the way." I put the knife down. My hands, spotted with age and veined with a lifetime of work, trembled slightly. I nodded. I always nodded. I wiped my hands on the apron Arthur had given me for our 25th anniversary, the fabric worn soft and thin, and walked out of the kitchen. I spent the next 4 hours in my bedroom on the 2nd floor. It was the room I used to share with Arthur, though Isabella had mentioned several times that it was too large for one person, and perhaps I would be more comfortable in the guest room downstairs. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the leaves fall from the old oak tree in the front yard. Downstairs, the house began to fill. I heard the doorbell ring, the boisterous laughter of men, the high-pitched greetings of women, the clinking of crystal glasses, the smells of roasted lamb and truffle oil wafted up the stairs, alien scents in a kitchen that used to smell of pot roast and apple pie. No one called for me. At 8 o'clock, hunger gnawed at my stomach, but it was the silence from the hallway that hurt more. I decided to go down, convincing myself that it was merely an oversight, that in the chaos of hosting they had simply forgotten to fetch me. I smoothed my hair, checked my reflection in the mirror, and told myself to smile. "A smile is a shield," Arthur used to say. I descended the staircase slowly. The dining room doors were open. The table was a masterpiece of modern elegance, set with the silver cutlery I had polished just the day before and the linen napkins I had starched. The chandelier cast a warm, golden glow over the scene. Isabella sat at the foot of the table, radiating triumph. Her father, a man with a booming voice, was recounting a story while everyone laughed in unison. Then, I looked for my seat. There were 10 people at the table, 10 chairs, all occupied. There was no empty space. There was no setting for me. Isabella looked up and saw me standing in the doorway. The laughter at the table didn't stop immediately. It died down slowly, like a fire running out of oxygen, as one by one the guests noticed my presence. Isabella stood up, not with an apology, but with the posture of a queen addressing a peasant who had wandered into the throne room. She walked over to me, blocking the view of the table. "Eleanor," she whispered, though the acoustics of the room carried her voice to every corner, "it's better if you eat in the kitchen tonight." I stared at her, unable to process the cruelty. "The kitchen?" "Yes," she said, her voice hardening. "This is a formal dinner. I only want family and important connections at the table. You wouldn't be comfortable. You'd be out of your depth. Besides, the seating chart is full." I looked past her at Daniel. My son. The boy I had nursed through fevers. The man I had comforted when his father died. The engineer who built bridges but couldn't seem to build a bridge back to me. He was looking down at his plate, his knuckles white as he gripped his fork. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. "Isabella," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I live here." "Don't be difficult," she snapped, abandoning the whisper. "Go eat in the kitchen, you messy old woman. I only want my family at the table." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. It wasn't just the insult, it was the erasure. In that moment, I wasn't a person to her. I was an appliance, a piece of furniture that had become inconvenient. I felt the tears pricking my eyes, hot and stinging, but I refused to let them fall. I gripped the fabric of my apron, the only anchor I had left. I turned around. I didn't storm off, I didn't scream. I simply turned my back on the people who thought I was disposable and walked toward the swinging door of the kitchen. But just as my hand touched the wood, the front door unlocked. Daniel had been at the table. But the man who had just walked in was the Daniel I remembered. Wait, no, let me clarify. My son was sitting at the table, paralyzed by his wife's dominance. The sound at the door was a courier, delivering a late package of wine. But the interruption broke the trance. Daniel looked up. He saw his mother, standing alone by the kitchen door, exiled in her own home. He saw his wife, standing with her back to him, radiating malice, and something in him snapped. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand the history of this house. You need to understand what led us to this precipice. You don't appreciate the sunlight until you have lived through a long, dark winter. Arthur and I bought this house when we were in our late 20s. We were young, foolishly in love, and broke. The house was a wreck. The roof leaked, the floorboards groaned, and the garden was a jungle of weeds. But Arthur saw potential. He was a carpenter with hands that could coax beauty out of the roughest wood. Every weekend, we worked. I stripped wallpaper while he sanded floors. We painted, we hammered, we planted. We built this life, literally with our own hands. Daniel was born in the master bedroom during a thunderstorm. I remember Arthur holding him for the first time, his large, rough hands cradling the infant with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "This is our legacy, Eleanor," he had whispered. When Arthur died of a sudden aneurysm 10 years ago, the light went out of the house. I was 58, a widow, drifting through rooms that felt too big and too quiet. Daniel was my anchor. He moved back in for a while, helping me manage the bills, fixing the things Arthur used to fix. He was a good son. He was gentle, kind, and fiercely protective. Then he met Isabella. She was an associate at the law firm where he consulted on engineering disputes. She was sharp, ambitious, and dazzling. When he first brought her home, I tried to be welcoming. I baked my signature lemon tart. I put fresh hydrangeas in the vases. Isabella walked in, looked around the living room, and wrinkled her nose slightly. "It smells like old paper," she said. That was the first crack. They married quickly. Isabella insisted they live here to save money for their own modern home. But as the months turned into years, it became clear she had no intention of leaving. She intended to conquer. The changes were subtle at first. My collection of ceramic owls was moved to the attic because they were tacky. The heavy velvet curtains Arthur loved were replaced with sheer, cold linen. My garden, my sanctuary of roses and lavender, was deemed too high maintenance and replaced with simple, stark hedges. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that change is inevitable. I told myself that a mother makes room. But with every object that was removed, a piece of my history was erased. And then the personal attacks began. Isabella would make comments about my cooking being too greasy, my clothes being outdated, my stories being boring. "Eleanor, you're repeating yourself," she would say at dinner. "Eleanor, nobody wants to hear about the price of milk in 1980. Daniel would look uncomfortable, but he never stopped her. He would squeeze my hand under the table, a silent apology that wasn't enough. He was caught between two women, and he was too afraid of losing his wife to defend his mother. Which brings us back to that Sunday night, the night the dam finally broke. As I pushed open the kitchen door, intending to disappear as commanded, I heard a chair scrape violently against the floorboards. "Stop." The voice was low, vibrating with a frequency I hadn't heard in years. It was Arthur's voice coming from Daniel's throat. I froze. The kitchen door swung shut, but I stayed right there, listening. Isabella laughed, a nervous, tinkling sound. "Daniel, sit down. Don't make a scene. Your mother prefers the kitchen. She feels out of place with people like this." "Is that what she told you?" Daniel asked. His voice was rising now, trembling with suppressed rage. "Or is that what you decided for her? Honey, please. My father is watching." "I don't care who is watching," Daniel shouted. The silence in the dining room was absolute now. I pushed the door open just a crack. Daniel was standing at the head of the table. His face was pale, his eyes burning. "You told my mother, the woman who owns this house, the woman who raised me, to eat in the kitchen like a dog?" Isabella stood her ground, her face flushing red. "She is a messy eater, Daniel. She slurps her soup. She tells embarrassing stories. She ruins the aesthetic. Look at this table. It's perfect. She doesn't fit." Daniel looked at the table. He looked at the crystal, the silver, the flowers. Then he grabbed the edge of the tablecloth. With one violent yank, he pulled. Plates crashed to the floor, crystal shattered, wine spilled like blood across the pristine carpet. The guests gasped and jumped back. Isabella screamed. "If she doesn't fit," Daniel roared, standing amidst the wreckage, "then none of us fit." He stormed over to where I was standing. He kicked the door open. He took my hand, his grip so tight it almost hurt. He pulled me into the dining room. He picked up one of the few surviving chairs from the head of the table, right where Isabella had been sitting, and slammed it down in the center of the room, facing the stunned guests. "Sit, Mom." "Daniel," I whispered, terrified. "You don't have to." "Sit down." I sat. Daniel turned to the room. His eyes swept over Isabella's parents, her brothers, his wife. "This house," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "was built by my father's hands. Every beam, every floorboard holds his sweat. My mother kept this home warm for 40 years. She scrubbed these floors. She cooked in that kitchen. She welcomed you into her home, and you treat her like a servant?" He looked at Isabella. She was trembling, tears of humiliation streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "You wanted a perfect dinner, Isabella? You wanted to show off your class? Well, here is a lesson in class. Class is not about silver spoons or expensive wine. Class is about dignity. It is about respect. And you? You have none." He looked at her parents, and you watched. You sat there and watched my wife humiliate an elder, a widow, in her own home, and you said nothing. You drank her wine and ate her food and said nothing. "Get out." "What?" Isabella's father sputtered. "Get out," Daniel screamed. "All of you. Now." It was a chaotic exodus. Coats were grabbed, apologies were mumbled, doors were slammed. Within 5 minutes, the house was empty of guests. Only the 3 of us remained in the ruins of the dining room. Isabella stood by the window, sobbing. "You maniac," she hissed. "You destroyed everything. You humiliated me in front of my family." "You humiliated yourself," Daniel said coldly. He knelt beside my chair. He took my trembling hands in his. "Mom, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I should have done this years ago. I was blind. I was a coward." I stroked his hair, just as I had when he was a boy. "It's okay, Daniel. It's okay." "No," Isabella screamed, turning to face us. "It is not okay. I am your wife, Daniel. I am your future. She is your past. You chose her over me? You chose a senile old woman over your wife?" Daniel stood up slowly. He looked at Isabella, and for the first time, I saw the love in his eyes extinguish. It just went out, like a candle pinched by wet fingers. I didn't choose her over you, Isabella. I chose decency over cruelty. And if you think my mother is the past, then you don't understand who I am. Because I am half her, and I am done apologizing for it. I'm leaving, Isabella spat. I'm going to a hotel. And don't expect me to come back until she is gone. It's her or me, Daniel. Decide. She stormed out, the front door slamming with a finality that shook the windows. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was the silence of a storm that has passed, leaving debris but also fresh air. Daniel slumped onto the floor amidst the broken china. He put his head in his hands and wept. I slid off the chair and sat beside him on the floor, ignoring the wine staining my dress. I held him while he cried for his marriage, for his mistakes, for the years we had lost. But as I held him, a clarity began to form in my mind. A sharp, painful, necessary truth. He had defended me. He had chosen me. But if I stayed, this war would never end. Isabella was vindictive, and Daniel loved her, or at least he loved the idea of her. If I stayed, I would be the wedge that kept them apart forever. I would be the reason for his unhappiness. And a mother cannot be the reason her son suffers. But there was more to it than that. I realized that night, looking at the shattered plates, that I didn't want this anymore. I didn't want to fight for a place at a table where I wasn't wanted. I didn't want to live in a house that was a battlefield. I wanted peace. And I couldn't find peace here. The next morning, while Daniel was asleep on the sofa, I made a pot of coffee. The smell of cinnamon and roasted beans filled the kitchen, reclaiming it for just a moment. I drank my cup standing up, looking out at the neglected garden. I went upstairs and began to pack. I didn't take much. My clothes, the photo albums, Arthur's watch, my rosary, and my apron. I folded the apron carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles. It was just a piece of cloth, stained with tomato sauce and grease, but it was my history. When Daniel woke up, I was waiting for him in the living room with 3 suitcases. "Mom?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "What are you doing?" "I'm leaving, Daniel." No, Mom, you don't have to go. I kicked them out. This is your house." "It was my house," I corrected gently. "But now it's your battlefield, and I am retiring from the war." "Mom, please. Isabella will calm down. We can fix this." I walked over to him and cupped his face. "Daniel, listen to me. You stood up for me last night. You gave me back my dignity. That is the greatest gift you could have given me. But I cannot live here anymore. I cannot live in a place where I have to shrink to fit. I need to find out who Eleanor is when she isn't fighting to be seen." "Where will you go?" he asked, tears welling in his eyes again. I called Martha. "You remember Martha? My old friend from the knitting circle? She has a spare room in her cottage by the coast. She's been asking me to visit for years." Daniel tried to argue, but he knew. He knew in his heart that I was right. He drove me to Martha's house in silence. When we arrived, he hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, son. Be brave." Watching his car drive away was one of the hardest moments of my life. I felt untethered, floating in a void without gravity. I was 68, homeless, and alone. Martha was a godsend. She was a boisterous woman, with a laugh like a trumpet and a house filled with cats and yarn. She welcomed me with open arms, but the first few weeks were agony. I missed my window. I missed the creak of the 3rd step on the stairs. I missed the ghost of Arthur. I felt useless. For 40 years, my identity had been service. I cooked, I cleaned, I cared. Without a house to manage or a family to serve, who was I? I spent days staring at the ocean, feeling like a piece of driftwood washed ashore. One afternoon, Martha sat me down. "Eleanor, stop waiting to die. You aren't a piece of furniture that's been put in storage. You are a woman. Do something." "I don't know what to do," I confessed. "Well, figure it out." I started taking walks, long walks into the small town near Martha's cottage. One day, I passed a community center. There was a sign in the window. "Help wanted. After-school cooking instructor for disadvantaged youth." I stopped. I looked at my hands. These hands that had chopped basil, kneaded dough, and polished silver. These hands that Isabella had called useless. I walked in. The director was a harried young woman named Sarah. She looked at me skeptically. "Do you have professional experience?" she asked. "I have 40 years of feeding a family that didn't always appreciate it," I said. "And I make a lasagna that can make a grown man cry." She hired me on the spot. The first day, I was terrified. There were 12 kids, ranging from 8 to 15. They were loud, messy, and skeptical of the old lady in the blue apron. I started with something simple: biscuits. I taught them how to cut the butter into the flour. I showed them that the heat of their hands matters. I taught them patience. There was a boy named Leo. He was 10, scrawny, with eyes that looked too old for his face. He struggled with the dough. It kept sticking to his fingers. He got frustrated and threw a handful of flour on the floor. "I can't do it," he yelled. "I'm stupid." I walked over to him. I didn't scold him. I knelt down so I was eye level with him. "You are not stupid, Leo. You are learning. And learning is messy. Look at me." He looked up. "I ruined a lot of biscuits before I got them right. The secret is to be gentle. You can't force the dough. You have to work with it." I guided his hands. We worked together. When the biscuits came out of the oven, golden and steaming, Leo took a bite. His eyes widened. A smile, genuine and bright, broke across his face. "I made this?" he asked. "You made that," I confirmed. That smile. It was worth more than all the fancy dinners in Savannah. Months passed. I wasn't just the cooking lady anymore. I was Miss Eleanor. The kids told me about their lives, their fears, their dreams. I wasn't invisible. I was essential. I started catering small events in the town. My lemon tart became famous locally. I rented a small studio apartment near the beach. It was tiny. My old walk-in closet was bigger, but it was mine. I bought yellow curtains. I bought a second-hand armchair. I filled the space with the smell of my own cooking. I found that dignity wasn't given to you by others. It wasn't something you waited for a son or a husband to bestow upon you. It was something you forged. Meanwhile, back in Savannah, the silence in the big house had turned into a scream. Daniel visited me once a month. I watched him transform. At first, he was defensive about Isabella. Then, he was tired. Finally, he was broken. Isabella hadn't come back after that night for 2 weeks. When she did, she demanded Daniel apologize. He refused. That was the beginning of the end. Without me there to be the lightning rod for her dissatisfaction, Isabella turned her focus on Daniel. Nothing he did was enough. He didn't earn enough. He wasn't ambitious enough. The house began to fall into disrepair. Isabella refused to clean, and they couldn't keep a housekeeper because she criticized them too harshly. The garden died. The warmth vanished. One rainy evening in March, nearly a year after I had left, Daniel showed up at my studio apartment. He was soaking wet, shivering, and holding a single suitcase. "She filed for divorce," he said, his voice hollow. "She said I held her back. She said she deserves someone better." I let him in. I made him hot soup. I wrapped him in a blanket. "I'm sorry, Mom. I lost the house. We have to sell it to split the assets. I lost everything." I looked at my son. He looked defeated, but I shook my head. "No, Daniel, you didn't lose everything. You lost a building. You lost a woman who didn't love you. But look at you. You are here. You are free. But the house, Dad's house. A house is just a box, Daniel. Home is where you are loved. And you are loved here." The divorce was messy. Isabella fought for every penny. She wanted spousal support, she wanted the furniture, she wanted to bleed him dry. But something strange happened. As the proceedings went on, Isabella's facade cracked. She alienated her friends. She fought with her partners at the law firm and was let go. Her parents, tired of her constant drama and demands, stopped taking her calls. She had wanted to be the queen, but she had burned her kingdom to the ground. 2 years after the dinner, I was walking through the farmer's market in my new town. I was buying peaches for a cobbler I was making for a charity event. I felt a hand on my arm. I turned around. It was Isabella's mother, Evelyn. She looked 10 years older. Her elegance was frayed. "Eleanor?" she asked. "Hello, Evelyn." She looked at me, taking in my glowing skin, my bright yellow scarf, the basket of fresh fruit on my arm. She looked at the peace that radiated from me. "You look wonderful," she stammered. "I feel wonderful. How are you?" She looked down. Isabella is struggling. She's living in a small apartment in the city. She can't keep a job. She's alone, Eleanor. She calls me crying, asking why everyone abandoned her. She doesn't understand. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. I wanted to apologize. For that night, we should have said something. We were wrong. I looked at this woman, a woman who had once looked down on me from the height of her social status. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the need to rub my victory in her face. I just felt a profound, quiet sadness for them. "Thank you, Evelyn," I said softly. "I accept your apology." She squeezed my arm. "You won, you know. In the end, you won." I shook my head. "No, Evelyn. It wasn't a competition. It was a tragedy. Nobody wins when a family breaks. But I survived, and sometimes survival is the greatest victory of all." I walked away, leaving her standing amidst the stalls of vegetables. I am writing this from the balcony of my small apartment. The ocean breeze is cool. Daniel is inside, setting the table for dinner. He met a nice woman named Claire a few months ago. She is a teacher. She loves my lemon tart. She laughs with her whole body. She asks me questions about my life and actually listens to the answers. My apron hangs on a hook by the door. I still use it, but it doesn't define me anymore. It is just a tool, like a hammer or a pen. That night at the dinner, I thought my life was over. I thought the rejection was a death sentence, but it was a birth. It pushed me out of a nest that had become a cage. If you are reading this, and you feel invisible in your own life, if you are shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's small heart, please listen to me. Do not wait for permission to be whole. Do not wait for an invitation to sit at the table. If they don't make room for you, build your own table. Dignity is not a loud shout. It is a quiet decision. It is the moment you stand up, smooth your apron, and walk away from the things that no longer serve your soul. The house in Savannah is sold. Strangers live there now. But I carry the home inside me, and for the first time in 68 years, I am not just a mother or a wife or a widow. I am Eleanor, and that is enough.